The sun was setting behind the jagged peaks of the Arizona Territory when Rancher first spotted the small figure huddled against the weathered fence post at the edge of his property. At 43 years old, Rancher had seen enough of life's cruelties to know trouble when it appeared on his doorstep. His weathered hands gripped the reins of his horse tighter as he approached what appeared to be a child, no more than 8 or 9 years old, wrapped in tattered cloth, barely moving. "Hi, how are you? I'm interrupting quickly just to ask you to click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will help a lot. Thank you, and I hope you liked the story." The child was Apache. That much was clear from her dark hair and the traditional beadwork still clinging to her torn dress. In 1887, tensions between settlers and the Apache tribes ran deeper than the Colorado River, and finding an Apache child alone on his land was like discovering a lit stick of dynamite in his barn. The recent conflicts with Geronimo's band had left the entire territory on edge, with every Apache face viewed with suspicion and fear. But as Rancher dismounted and knelt beside the girl, he saw something that cut through years of prejudice and fear, pure, desperate hunger in her dark eyes. "Easy there, little one," Rancher whispered, his voice roughened by years of solitude. The child flinched but didn't run. She was too weak to run. Her lips were cracked from dehydration, her small frame trembling not just from the desert cold, but from starvation that had clearly lasted for days, perhaps weeks. Her clothes, once beautiful traditional Apache garments with intricate beadwork, were now torn and stained with dust and dried blood. Without hesitation, Rancher scooped her into his arms, feeling how light she was, like a bird with broken wings. The ride back to his ranch house was silent, except for the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves and the child's shallow breathing against his chest. Rancher's mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Where had she come from? The nearest Apache reservation was over 100 miles south, and the closest known Apache camps were even further into the mountains. Where was her family? And most pressing of all, what was he going to do with her? His ranch sat in a valley surrounded by red rocks and sparse vegetation, a modest operation that had taken him 15 years to build from nothing. The house was simple but sturdy, built to withstand both the elements and the isolation that came with choosing to live on the frontier. He'd chosen this location specifically for its remoteness. After losing his wife Margaret and young son Thomas to fever during the harsh winter of 1879 back in Missouri, he'd wanted nothing more than to escape the memories and the pitying looks of neighbors who didn't know what to say to a man who'd lost everything. As he carried the child inside, Rancher felt the weight of a decision that would change everything. His home was sparse but clean, a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bedroom that had remained largely unused since he'd built the place. The walls were bare except for a single photograph of his deceased family, which he'd covered with a cloth years ago because the pain of seeing their faces had been too much to bear. He laid her gently on his bed and went to prepare some broth from the rabbit he'd caught that morning. The child watched him with wary eyes, ready to bolt despite her weakness. Her dark eyes followed his every movement, and he could see the intelligence there. This was no ordinary child. There was something ancient in her gaze, as if she'd seen things that no child should ever witness. When he offered her the warm soup, she hesitated before accepting it with trembling hands. She ate slowly, carefully, as if each spoonful might be her last. Rancher noticed the way she held the bowl, with both hands, protectively. the way someone who'd known real hunger would hold food. It broke something inside his chest that had been frozen for years. "What's your name?" Rancher asked softly, but the child only stared at him in silence. He tried again in the few Apache words he'd picked up over the years from trading with peaceful bands, but still no response. Either she didn't understand, or she was too frightened to speak. He suspected it was the latter. There was understanding in her eyes when he spoke, but also a deep wariness that spoke of recent trauma. As night fell, Rancher made a bed for her on the floor near the fireplace, giving her his warmest blanket, a thick wool covering that had been a wedding gift from his mother-in-law. He settled into his chair by the window, his rifle within easy reach, not because he feared the child, but because he knew what morning would bring. Word would spread quickly in the small town of Cedar Ridge that he'd taken in an Apache child. The reactions would not be kind. Cedar Ridge was a town built on fear and suspicion. The recent Apache wars had left deep scars on the community. 3 years earlier, a raiding party had attacked the Henderson Ranch, killing the entire family except for young Billy Henderson, who'd hidden in the root cellar for 2 days before being found. The boy still woke up screaming some nights, and his aunt, who'd taken him in, had never been the same. Stories like that had hardened hearts throughout the territory. The child fell asleep quickly, exhaustion overcoming fear. Rancher watched her small form rise and fall with each breath, and something stirred in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. A protective instinct he thought had died with his own family back in Missouri. His wife, Margaret, had always wanted more children after Thomas, but the fever had taken them both before that dream could be realized. Now, looking at this vulnerable child, those protective feelings came flooding back with an intensity that surprised him. Around midnight, Rancher was jolted awake by the acrid smell of smoke. He rushed to the window and his blood ran cold. His barn was engulfed in flames, the orange glow illuminating the entire valley like a scene from hell itself. The fire was massive, far too large to be accidental. Someone had used accelerant, probably coal oil, to ensure the structure would burn completely. He grabbed his rifle and boots, glancing back at the sleeping child. Whoever had done this knew about her. It was no coincidence that his barn burned the very night he'd taken her in. The timing was too perfect, too deliberate. Someone had been watching his ranch, waiting for the right moment to send their message. Racing outside, Rancher could only watch helplessly as months of stored hay and grain turned to ash. The fire was too far advanced to save anything, but as he circled the burning structure, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. Carved into the dirt near the barn's entrance were symbols, not random marks, but deliberate Apache symbols that he recognized from his years on the frontier. But something was wrong with them. The symbols were crude, made by someone who didn't truly understand their meaning. The message was clear: return the child or face the consequences. But the execution was flawed, suggesting the perpetrator was trying to implicate the Apache while lacking real knowledge of their customs. As Rancher stood there, watching his livelihood burn, he calculated the loss. The barn had contained enough hay to feed his cattle through the winter, plus grain worth nearly $200, more money than most men in the territory saw in a year. His tools, his spare tack, everything he needed to run his operation had been stored in that building. The financial blow was devastating, but it was the deliberate nature of the act that truly chilled him. But as the flames reached their peak, casting dancing shadows across the valley, He made a decision that would define him. He wouldn't be intimidated. The child had come to him for help, and he would not abandon her to whatever fate awaited her out there in the darkness. Whatever secrets surrounded her presence, whatever dangers lay ahead, he would face them. He'd already lost one family to circumstances beyond his control. He wouldn't lose another to human cruelty. Behind him, he heard a soft footstep. The child had awakened and stood in the doorway, her dark eyes reflecting the flames. The orange light played across her face, revealing features that spoke of nobility and strength despite her youth. For the first time, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper but carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. "I'm sorry." Rancher turned to her, his jaw set with determination. "You have nothing to be sorry for, little one. Nothing at all." The child stepped closer, her small hand reaching out to touch his arm. "They burned your food house because of me, because I am Apache. They burned my barn because they're cowards," Rancher replied firmly. "Because they're afraid of a little girl who's done nothing wrong except be born Apache." As the barn collapsed in a shower of sparks and embers, sending a column of smoke into the star-filled sky, Rancher realized that this was only the beginning. Someone wanted this child gone badly enough to destroy his property as a warning. But who? And more importantly, why was this small, starving girl worth such extreme measures? The child moved closer to him, seeking comfort in his presence. "My name is Ayana," she said quietly. "It means eternal blossom in the language of my people. My grandfather gave me this name because he said I would survive when others could not." "Ayana," Rancher repeated, tasting the name. It was beautiful, like the child herself. "I'm honored to know your name, Ayana, and I promise you this. Whoever did this will not drive you away. You're safe here." But even as he made the promise, Rancher wondered if he could keep it. The fire had been a warning, but what would come next? And what secrets was Ayana carrying that made someone willing to go to such lengths to silence her? The answers would have to wait until morning. But one thing was certain. Rancher's quiet life was over, and the real mystery was just beginning. As they stood together watching the last of the flames die down to glowing embers, both the grizzled rancher and the Apache child knew that their fates were now intertwined, for better or worse. The night wind carried the smell of smoke and ash across the valley, but it also carried something else, the promise of a storm approaching from the mountains, as if nature itself was responding to the violence that had been done. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new revelations that would shake the very foundations of everything Rancher thought he knew about his community and himself. Dawn broke gray and smoky over the valley, the acrid smell of burned wood hanging in the air like a funeral shroud. Rancher stood among the charred remains of his barn, sifting through the ashes with a heavy heart. 20 years of careful saving and hard work reduced to blackened timber and twisted metal. The iron tools he'd saved for years to buy were now warped and useless. His saddles, bridles, and other leather goods had been reduced to ash. But it was the symbols carved in the dirt that truly troubled him. Symbols that suggested this was more than simple intimidation. Ayana sat on his porch steps, wrapped in his spare coat that hung nearly to the ground on her small frame. She'd spoken little since revealing her name, but her dark eyes missed nothing. She watched him with an intensity that seemed far beyond her years, as if she understood the gravity of their situation better than he did. When he'd tried to coax more from her over breakfast, Simple biscuits and coffee, the best he could manage with his limited supplies. She'd eaten gratefully, but remained largely silent. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his investigation. A dust cloud on the horizon grew larger, and soon Rancher could make out Sheriff Tom Bradley leading a group of 6 men from town. Their faces were grim, their hands resting conspicuously on their gun belts. Word had traveled fast, just as he'd expected. In a territory where news traveled by horseback and word of mouth, a barn fire was major news, especially when it involved an Apache child. Sheriff Bradley was a fair man, but he was also practical. At 55, he'd kept the peace in Cedar Ridge for over a decade by knowing when to bend and when to stand firm. He'd served in the Union Army during the war between the states, losing his left arm at Gettysburg, and had come west seeking a fresh start like so many others. His weathered face showed the strain of a man caught between duty and public pressure, between doing what was right and doing what was expedient. "Morning, Rancher," Bradley called out as the group reined in their horses. "Heard you had some trouble last night." "That's one way to put it," Rancher replied, gesturing toward the ruins. "Someone decided to send me a message." The men behind Bradley shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Rancher recognized them all. Marcus Webb, who ran the general store and served on the town council. Dr. Samuel Hayes, the town physician who'd arrived from back east 5 years earlier. Frank Morrison, the banker who controlled most of the credit in the territory. Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church, and 2 others whose faces he knew, but whose names escaped him. They were good men mostly, pillars of the community who genuinely cared about the welfare of Cedar Ridge. But fear had a way of twisting good intentions into something darker. "We also heard," Webb spoke up, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "that you've taken in an Apache child. Is that true?" Rancher's jaw tightened. He could see Ayanna from the corner of his eye, sitting perfectly still on the porch, listening to every word. "I found a starving child on my land. I gave her food and shelter. That's what any decent person would do." "Any decent person," Morrison interjected, his banker's precision evident even in his anger, "would have taken her to the Indian Agency office in Tucson. You know the law, Rancher. Apache children found off the reservation are supposed to be returned immediately. The territorial government has been very clear about this policy. She's not a stray dog, Morrison. She's a little girl who was dying of hunger." "Doctor." Hayes leaned forward in his saddle, his medical bag visible behind him. His pale hands gripped the reins tightly, and Rancher noticed a slight tremor in his fingers. "Where is she now? I should examine her. Make sure she's not carrying any diseases. Apache camps are known to have sanitation issues." The implication hung in the air like a slap. The suggestion that Ayanna might be diseased simply because of her heritage was both ignorant and insulting. Rancher felt his temper rising but forced himself to remain calm. "She's fine. Malnourished, but otherwise healthy." Pastor Williams, a thin man with kind eyes who'd always preached tolerance and Christian charity, looked genuinely conflicted. "Rancher, I understand your Christian impulse to help the child. The Good Samaritan parable teaches us to aid those in need. But we must also consider the safety of our community. The Apache have been unpredictable lately." "Unpredictable." Rancher's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. "A starving child is unpredictable?" Sheriff Bradley held up a hand to quiet the murmurs from his companions. "Rancher, I understand your intentions are good, but you've got to see the position this puts us all in. The Apache have been quiet for months now, and we'd like to keep it that way. Having one of their children here could be seen as provocative. There are people in town who remember the Henderson massacre, the attacks on the supply wagons. They see that child as a symbol of everything they fear and hate. And now, with your barn burned down the same night you took her in, Morrison added, shaking his head, it looks like someone's trying to send a message. Maybe the Apache want her back. Maybe they're angry that you interfered. Webb's horse danced nervously as its rider's agitation grew. Maybe the message is that we shouldn't be harboring their kind. Maybe whoever burned your barn was trying to protect this town from what's coming. The words hit Rancher like a physical blow. Are you suggesting that someone from Cedar Ridge did this? I'm not suggesting anything. Webb backtracked quickly, but his eyes betrayed him. I'm just saying that people are scared, and scared people do desperate things. The Hendersons were good people, God-fearing folk who never hurt anyone. But that didn't stop the Apache from butchering them in their beds. Doctor, Hayes cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps the best solution would be for me to examine the child and then arrange for her transport to the proper authorities. It would be the safest course for everyone involved. The Indian Agency has facilities designed for situations like this. Rancher looked at each man in turn, seeing fear and prejudice masquerading as reason. These were his neighbors, people he'd known for years, men he'd shared drinks with at the saloon and worked alongside during barn raisings and harvest times. But in this moment, they felt like strangers. And what happens to her then? You think the Indian Agency cares about one Apache child? You think they'll make sure she finds her family? That's not our responsibility, Morrison said flatly, his banker's mentality reducing human lives to ledger entries. Our responsibility is to the people of Cedar Ridge, to the families who've invested their lives and fortunes in building this community. Pastor Williams looked uncomfortable with Morrison's cold assessment. Surely we can find a Christian solution that protects both the child and our community. Perhaps one of the missions could take her in, help her find her people through proper channels. The conversation was interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps. Ayanna had approached quietly, moving, with the natural stealth that seemed bred into her people. She stood now at Rancher's side, looking up at the mounted men with no fear in her eyes, only a quiet dignity that seemed far beyond her years. Her small hand slipped into Rancher's weathered one, a gesture of trust that spoke louder than words. For a moment, no one spoke. The sight of the small Apache girl standing beside the grizzled rancher created a tableau that challenged every preconception the men had brought with them. She was just a child, clearly vulnerable and in need of protection, yet her presence seemed to fill them with an inexplicable dread. Then she did something that shocked them all. In clear accented English, she said, "My name is Ayanna. It means eternal blossom. My grandfather taught me your language before the soldiers came to our camp." The revelation that she could speak English sent a ripple of surprise through the group. Sheriff Bradley leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. "Ayanna, that's a beautiful name. Can you tell us where you came from? Where is your family?" Ayanna looked up at Rancher before answering, seeking permission or perhaps reassurance. When he nodded encouragingly, she spoke again. "They are gone, all gone. The sickness came to our camp, and then the soldiers. I walked for many days to find safety." "What kind of sickness?" Dr. Hayes asked, his medical training overriding his prejudice for a moment. "Was it fever? Consumption? Cholera? But Ayanna had retreated back into silence, moving closer to Rancher's side. Something about the doctor's questions had clearly disturbed her, though she couldn't articulate why. Morrison's impatience was growing. "Look, this is all very touching, but we have a practical problem here. The territorial governor has been very clear about these matters. Apache children found off the reservation must be returned immediately. There are no exceptions. Even if returning her means her death?" Rancher asked pointedly. "That's not our decision to make," Webb replied. "We have laws for a reason. If we start making exceptions, where does it end? Do we take in every Apache child who wanders onto our land? Do we ignore territorial policy whenever our emotions get involved?" Pastor Williams struggled visibly with the moral implications. "The Bible teaches us to care for orphans and widows, to show mercy to the vulnerable, but it also teaches us to obey the authorities that God has placed over us." Sheriff Bradley sighed heavily, the weight of his position evident in every line of his face. "Rancher, I'm going to give you 24 hours to figure this out. After that, I'll have to follow proper procedures. The territorial governor has been very clear about these matters, and I can't ignore my sworn duty, no matter how I might feel personally." As the group prepared to leave, Webb turned back one final time. "You're making a mistake, Rancher. That child is going to bring nothing but trouble to this town. Mark my words. Before this is over, people are going to get hurt, and their blood will be on your hands." Dr. Hayes lingered for a moment after the others had started to ride away. "If you change your mind about the examination, send word. I have experience with their kind. I know what to look for." There was something in the doctor's tone that made Rancher's skin crawl, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what bothered him. Hayes spurred his horse and caught up with the others, leaving Rancher and Ayanna alone with the smoking ruins of the barn. After they'd ridden away, Rancher knelt down to Ayanna's level. "You don't have to be afraid to talk to me. I won't let anyone hurt you." Ayanna studied his face for a long moment before speaking. "The fire, it was not Apache who did this thing." Rancher felt his blood chill. "How do you know?" "The symbols in the dirt. They are wrong, made by someone who does not understand our ways." Her dark eyes met his with startling intensity. "Someone from your town wants you to think it was my people, but it was not." The implications of her words hit Rancher like a thunderbolt. If Ayanna was right, then someone in Cedar Ridge had burned his barn and tried to make it look like Apache revenge. But who? And more importantly, why go to such lengths to get rid of one's small child? "There's something else," Ayanna continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The medicine man with the pale skin, I have seen him before." "Dr. Hayes? Where did you see him?" "At our camp, before the sickness came. He brought medicine, but—" She shuddered, unable or unwilling to continue. Rancher felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. "But what, Ayanna? What happened after he brought the medicine? People died? Many people? My grandfather said the medicine was poison, but no one believed him. They said he was old and foolish." Tears began to form in her dark eyes. "But I believed him. I always believed my grandfather." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting harsh shadows across the valley, Rancher realized that the mystery was deeper than he'd imagined. Someone in his own community was willing to destroy property and manipulate evidence to ensure Ayanna's removal. But if her story about Dr. Hayes was true, the conspiracy might involve something far more sinister than simple prejudice. Looking down at the brave little girl beside him, Rancher made a silent vow. He would get to the bottom of this, no matter what it cost him. Because if someone was willing to burn down his barn to get rid of Ayanna, and if Dr. Hayes was somehow involved in the death of her people, then the stakes were higher than anyone in Cedar Ridge realized. The question was whether he could uncover the truth before whoever was behind this decided that warnings were no longer sufficient, and that more direct action was required to silence the only witness to their crimes. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Rancher rode into Cedar Ridge, with Ayanna seated behind him on his horse. The decision to bring her to town had not been easy, but after her revelation about the false Apache symbols and her disturbing comments about Dr. Hayes, he knew he needed to investigate further. If someone in Cedar Ridge was behind the barn burning, and if there was truth to Ayanna's suspicions about the doctor, then he intended to find out exactly what was going on. The main street of Cedar Ridge was typical of frontier towns, a wide dirt road flanked by wooden buildings that served the basic needs of settlers and ranchers. The general store, saloon, doctor's office, and sheriff's station formed the heart of the community, while smaller shops and residences spread out from there like the spokes of a wheel. The town had grown considerably since Rancher first arrived in the territory, with new businesses and families arriving regularly as the railroad pushed ever westward. Today, however, the usual bustle seemed subdued, and Rancher noticed how conversations stopped and heads turned as he passed. Word of his decision to harbor an Apache child had clearly spread throughout the community, and the reactions were mixed. Some faces showed curiosity, others displayed open hostility, and a few revealed what might have been sympathy or support. But all showed the tension that had gripped the town since news of the barn fire had spread. Their first stop was the general store, where Marcus Webb was arranging supplies behind the counter. Webb's establishment was the commercial heart of Cedar Ridge, selling everything from flour and coffee to ammunition and farming tools. The store also served as an unofficial gathering place where news and gossip were exchanged along with goods and services. Webb's face darkened when he saw Ayanna, but he maintained a veneer of politeness that fooled no one. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged cans on a shelf, and Rancher noticed that the man seemed unusually nervous. "Rancher, didn't expect to see you in town today, especially not with her. I need to ask you something, Webb," Rancher said, keeping his voice level. "Last night, when my barn burned, did you see anything unusual? Anyone heading out toward my place?" Webb's eyes darted nervously around the store, as if checking to make sure they weren't overheard. "I was home with my family all evening. Why would you think I'd know anything about that?" "Just asking all the neighbors," Rancher replied, studying Webb's reaction carefully. "You mentioned yesterday that maybe whoever burned my barn was trying to protect the town. Sounded like you might know something specific." "I was just speaking generally," Webb said quickly, his hands fidgeting with a bolt of cloth. "People are scared, that's all. Having an Apache child here brings back bad memories. The Henderson massacre, the attacks on the supply trains. People remember these things." Ayanna tugged gently on Rancher's sleeve. When he looked down, she whispered in Apache, then translated, "He is lying. His hands shake like my grandfather's did when he told stories that were not true." Rancher nodded slightly, filing away the observation. "Well, if you remember anything, let me know." As they prepared to leave, Webb called out, "Rancher, you're playing with fire here. That child, There are things about her situation that you don't understand. Things that could put this whole town in danger." "What kind of things?" Rancher asked, turning back. But Webb had already retreated behind his counter, busying himself with inventory and refusing to meet Rancher's eyes. "Just be careful. That's all I'm saying." Their next stop was Dr. Hayes's office. The physician's practice was located in a neat wooden building that also served as his residence. Hayes had arrived in Cedar Ridge 5 years earlier, claiming to have studied medicine in Philadelphia before coming west for his health. He'd quickly established himself as a competent doctor, though some in town found his manner cold and his methods sometimes unconventional. Hayes was more welcoming than Webb had been, offering to examine Ayanna and expressing what seemed like genuine concern for her welfare. But Rancher noticed that the doctor's hands shook slightly when he looked at the child, and there was something in his eyes. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. "She appears to be in good health, considering her ordeal," Hayes said after a cursory examination, "though I would recommend a more thorough evaluation. Apache children sometimes carry diseases that our people have no immunity to." "She's been with me for 2 days now," Rancher pointed out. "If she was carrying anything contagious, wouldn't I have shown symptoms by now?" "Not necessarily. Some diseases have longer incubation periods." Hayes's voice was professional, but his eyes kept darting. To Ayanna, with an expression that made Rancher uncomfortable. When Rancher asked about the previous night, Hayes became evasive. "I was making rounds to the Morrison Ranch," Hayes said. "Their youngest had a fever. Didn't get back until well past midnight." "The Morrison Ranch is north of town," Rancher observed. "You would have passed near my place on the way back. See anything?" Hayes hesitated just a moment too long. "No, nothing unusual, though I did notice quite a bit of smoke in the air when I returned to town." Ayanna remained quiet during this exchange, but Rancher could feel her tension. When they left the doctor's office, she spoke quietly. "The medicine man smells of smoke and fear, but there is something else, something that makes my spirit uneasy." "What do you mean?" "He has the smell of death on him. Not the clean death of battle or old age, but the bad death. The death that comes from poison and lies." Before Rancher could ask what she meant, they were approached by a woman he'd seen around town but never formally met. She was perhaps 30 years old, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. Her dress was simple but clean, and she carried herself with the dignity of someone who'd faced hardship and survived. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "I'm Sarah Mitchell. I run the boarding house." She looked down at Ayanna with genuine warmth. "I heard about what happened to your barn, and I wanted you to know that not everyone in town agrees with the way you're being treated." Rancher tipped his hat. "I appreciate that, ma'am." Sarah glanced around nervously before continuing. "There's something you should know. Last night I saw Dr. Hayes and Frank Morrison talking outside the saloon around 9 o'clock. They seemed very agitated about something, and I heard Morrison mention your name. This was new information, and potentially significant. Did you hear what they were discussing?" "Not clearly, but Morrison kept saying something about taking care of the problem before it gets worse. And Dr. Hayes mentioned something about the girl knowing too much." Rancher felt his pulse quicken. "Knowing too much about what?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, but they both looked very worried. And then they separated. Morrison headed toward the bank, and Dr. Hayes rode out of town. Ayanna suddenly gripped Rancher's arm. "The medicine man. He was at the place where my family died." The words hit Rancher like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" Ayana's voice was barely a whisper, but her words carried the weight of terrible truth. 3 moons ago, soldiers came to our camp. They said we had to move to the reservation, but some of the warriors wanted to fight. There was sickness in our camp, the coughing sickness that kills. The medicine man with the pale skin came to help, but after he left, more people died. My grandfather said the medicine was poison. Dr. Hayes. Rancher's mind raced as the pieces began falling into place. Ayana, are you saying Dr. Hayes was at your Apache camp? She nodded solemnly. He came with papers from the government, said he would help with the sickness. But my grandfather was wise. He saw the truth in the medicine man's eyes. After the pale medicine man left, my grandfather hid me and told me to run if the soldiers came back. Sarah gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. You're saying Dr. Hayes poisoned Apache families? It would explain a lot, Rancher said grimly. If Hayes was involved in some kind of government operation to clear Apache lands by poisoning them, and Ayana is a witness, then she's not just an orphaned child, Sarah finished. She's evidence of murder. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Hayes had been systematically poisoning Apache families under the guise of medical treatment, it would be one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. And if Frank Morrison was involved, it suggested a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the local community. We need to get to Sheriff Bradley, Rancher said urgently. But as they turned toward the sheriff's office, they found their path blocked by Morrison himself, flanked by 2 men Rancher didn't recognize. The banker's face was pale but determined, and his companions looked like the kind of men who solved problems with violence rather than words. I'm afraid I can't let you do that, Morrison said quietly. Too much is at stake. So it's true, Rancher said, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. You and Hayes have been murdering Apache families. Morrison's composure cracked slightly. You don't understand the bigger picture. The territorial government needed those lands cleared for the railroad. The Apache wouldn't move voluntarily, and military action would have drawn unwanted attention from Washington. Hayes found a way to make it look like natural disease. No one was supposed to get hurt who didn't have to. No one was supposed to get hurt? Rancher's voice rose in disbelief. You murdered entire families. It was for the greater good, Morrison insisted, his banker's mentality reducing human lives to acceptable losses. The railroad will bring prosperity to this entire region. Jobs, commerce, civilization. A few Apache lives against the future of hundreds of settlers. It was a necessary sacrifice. Sarah stepped forward, her voice shaking with anger. You're talking about genocide, about murdering innocent people for money. I'm talking about progress, Morrison replied coldly. About building a future for our children. The Apache were a dying people anyway. We simply accelerated the inevitable. Ayana stepped forward, her young voice carrying surprising strength. My grandfather was right about the evil in your heart, but he was wrong about one thing. I am not the only one who knows the truth. Morrison's face went white. What do you mean? My cousin, Dakota, escaped too. He is with the Apache who still fight in the mountains. He saw everything just as I did. And he is coming. The sound of approaching horses echoed through the street, and Morrison's men looked nervously toward the edge of town. In the distance, a dust cloud was rising, too large to be a single rider or even a small group. You're lying, Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. Ayana smiled for the first time since Rancher had found her. Apache do not lie about family. Dakota will bring warriors, and they will bring justice. But as the sound of horses grew louder, Rancher realized something that made him smile grimly. The riders approaching weren't Apache warriors seeking vengeance. The dust pattern was wrong, the sound too organized. These were cavalry horses, moving in formation. "Expecting someone else, Morrison?" Rancher asked. Before Morrison could answer, Sheriff Bradley appeared from around the corner of the bank, followed by a contingent of federal marshals and cavalry troopers. The lead marshal was a stern-faced man with silver hair and a badge that gleamed in the afternoon sun. "Frank Morrison," the marshal announced. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and violation of federal treaties with the Apache Nation." Morrison's defiance crumbled like a house of cards. Who told you?" The marshal gestured, and from behind the group of lawmen rode a young Apache man, perhaps 16 years old, with intelligent eyes and the same dignified bearing as Ayanna. The girl ran to him, and they embraced with the joy of family reunited. "This is Dakota," Sheriff Bradley explained to Rancher. "He's been working with federal investigators for the past month, providing evidence of a conspiracy to poison Apache families and steal their land for railroad development." As the pieces of the puzzle finally came together, Rancher realized that the mystery was far from over. The arrest of Morrison was just the beginning. There were still questions to be answered, justice to be served, and a community to heal from the revelation that some of its most respected citizens were capable of unspeakable evil. The dust cloud on the horizon grew larger as the sound of approaching horses echoed through Cedar Ridge's main street. Frank Morrison's face had gone ashen, and his two companions were nervously checking their weapons, clearly realizing that their carefully laid plans were unraveling. But Rancher noticed something that made him smile grimly. The riders approaching weren't Apache warriors seeking vengeance, as Morrison had feared. They were federal marshals and cavalry troopers, moving with the disciplined precision of law enforcement. "Expecting someone else, Morrison?" Rancher asked, his hand still resting on his gun. Before Morrison could answer, Ayanna spoke up with the wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. "I did not lie about my cousin Dakota, but he is not coming with warriors. He is coming with the law." Sheriff Bradley and 6 federal marshals rode up to the tense standoff in the middle of Main Street. The lead marshal, a stern-faced man with silver hair and a badge that gleamed in the afternoon sun, dismounted and surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every form of human corruption. "Frank Morrison," the marshal announced, his voice carrying the authority of the federal government. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, violation of federal treaties with the Apache Nation, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government." Morrison's defiance crumbled like a dam bursting under pressure. Who told you?" The marshal gestured, and from behind the group of lawmen rode a young Apache man, perhaps 16 years old, with intelligent eyes and the same dignified bearing as Ayanna. The girl ran to him, and they embraced with the joy of family reunited against impossible odds. "This is Dakota," Sheriff Bradley explained to Rancher. "He's been working with federal investigators for the past month, providing evidence of a conspiracy to poison Apache families and steal their land for railroad development." Dakota spoke in fluent English, his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge and hard-won maturity. "When my cousin disappeared, I knew she must have witnessed what happened to our families. I went to the territorial capital and told them everything I had seen. Doctor, Hayes and Morrison have been murdering our people for months, making it look like disease while they cleared the land for their railroad friends. The lead marshal stepped forward, his expression grim. We've been investigating reports of unusual death rates among Apache families in this region for the better part of a year. When Dakota came forward with his testimony, we realized we were dealing with a systematic campaign of genocide disguised as medical treatment. Morrison made one last desperate attempt to justify his actions, his banker's mentality still trying to reduce human lives to numbers on a ledger. You don't understand the economic implications. The railroad contract would have brought thousands of jobs to this region, millions of dollars in investment. The Apache lands were needed for the greater good of... The greater good? Rancher interrupted, his voice thick with disgust. You murdered children, Morrison. Entire families. There's no economic justification for genocide. Dr. Hayes chose that moment to appear from his office, clearly intending to flee town. His medical bag was packed and his horse was saddled and ready, but he stopped short when he saw the marshals and the crowd that had gathered. His medical bag fell from nerveless fingers as he realized his crimes had been exposed. Samuel Hayes, the marshal called out. You're also under arrest for murder, conspiracy, and violations of your medical oath. Hayes looked around desperately, seeking an escape route that didn't exist. The entire town had turned out to witness the arrests, and their faces showed a mixture of shock, anger, and shame. I was following government orders. I was told it was a matter of national security. No government official authorized the murder of innocent families, the marshal replied firmly. You acted on your own, motivated by greed and a misguided belief in racial superiority. As the marshals moved to arrest both men, Sarah Mitchell stepped forward from the crowd that had gathered. There's something else you should know, she said, addressing the lead marshal. Morrison and Hayes weren't acting alone. They had help from someone who knew the area well enough to burn Rancher's barn and make it look like Apache revenge. All eyes turned to Marcus Webb, who had been trying to slip away unnoticed through the crowd. His face was flushed with guilt and fear as he realized he'd been spotted. The general store owner looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes. Webb? Sheriff Bradley said with disappointment heavy in his voice. Tell me you weren't part of this. Webb's shoulders sagged in defeat, the weight of his crimes finally overwhelming his ability to maintain the facade. They said it would just be a warning. Burn the barn, leave some fake Apache symbols, scare Rancher into giving up the girl. I never knew about the poisoning until last night, I swear. But you knew enough to help cover it up, Rancher said, his voice cold with anger. The marshal nodded to his men, who moved to arrest Webb as well. Conspiracy and arson charges for you, Mr. Webb, and possibly accessory to murder depending on what our investigation reveals. As the three conspirators were led away in shackles, the crowd of townspeople began to disperse, many of them looking ashamed of how they had treated Rancher and Ayanna. But the revelation of the conspiracy had shaken the community to its core, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice, greed, and the capacity for evil that existed even in their small frontier town. Dakota approached Rancher with Ayanna at his side, his young face showing maturity far beyond his years. My cousin tells me you saved her life and protected her when others would have turned her away. Our people do not forget such kindness. I just did what anyone should have done, Rancher replied, uncomfortable with praise for what he saw as basic human decency. No, Ayanna said softly, her small hand slipping into his weathered one. You did what a good man does. You saw a child in need and helped, even when it cost you greatly. The lead marshal cleared his throat, drawing their attention. There's one more matter to address. Ayanna and Takoda are the last surviving members of their immediate family. They need a place to stay while we sort out their legal status and determine their future. Rancher looked down at Ayanna, seeing hope and trust in her dark eyes. The thought of losing her now, after everything they'd been through together, was unbearable. They're welcome to stay with me as long as they need. Sheriff Bradley smiled for the first time that day. I think that's an excellent solution. And Rancher, the territorial government will be compensating you for your barn and any other losses you suffered. It's the least they can do after what you've endured. As the crowd continued to disperse, Dr. Hayes called out desperately from the back of the marshal's wagon. You don't understand. The Apache were going to be moved anyway. I was just speeding up the inevitable. The railroad needs that land. Takoda turned to face the disgraced doctor, his young voice carrying the wisdom of his ancestors. My grandfather taught me that there is no honor in taking life for personal gain. You will face justice, but more importantly, you will face yourself and what you have become. 3 months later, Rancher stood in front of his newly rebuilt barn, watching Ayanna and Takoda help with the evening chores. The federal investigation had exposed a conspiracy that reached all the way to corrupt officials in the territorial capital, leading to multiple arrests and a complete overhaul of Indian affairs policies in the region. The scandal had made national headlines, forcing the government to confront the systematic abuse of Native American tribes throughout the West. Morrison, Hayes, and Webb had all been convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Morrison received 25 years for conspiracy to commit murder and fraud. Hayes, as the primary architect of the poisoning scheme, was sentenced to life in prison. Webb, whose cooperation with investigators had helped expose the full extent of the conspiracy, received 10 years for arson and conspiracy. The railroad company, faced with the scandal of their illegal land acquisition methods and the negative publicity surrounding the genocide, had abandoned their plans for the route through Apache territory. Instead, they had negotiated a new agreement with the territorial government that provided fair compensation to Apache tribes for any land use and guaranteed their rights to traditional hunting and gathering areas. But perhaps most importantly, the case had led to new federal protections for Apache families and a formal apology from the territorial government. Takoda had been offered a position as a liaison between the Apache tribes and federal authorities, helping to ensure that such atrocities never happened again. His intelligence and natural leadership abilities had impressed the federal investigators, and they saw him as a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for too long. Ayanna had blossomed in the months since the crisis, her natural intelligence and curiosity making her an eager student, as Rancher taught her to read and write English. In return, she and Takoda had taught him Apache customs and language, creating a unique family bound not by blood, but by shared experience and mutual respect. The ranch had become a place of healing and hope, where two cultures could meet and learn from each other. The people of Cedar Ridge had also changed, though the process had been painful and difficult. Faced with the reality of what their prejudice and fear had enabled, many had made genuine efforts to reach out to the Apache community and build bridges of understanding. Sarah Mitchell had started a school that welcomed children of all backgrounds. and the town had established a memorial to the victims of Morrison and Hayes's crimes. Pastor Williams had used the tragedy as an opportunity to preach about the dangers of hatred and the Christian duty to love one's neighbors, regardless of their race or background. His sermons had been powerful and moving, helping to heal some of the divisions that had torn the community apart. But the healing process hadn't been universal. Some families had left Cedar Ridge, unable to face the shame of what had been done in their name. Others had doubled down on their prejudices, blaming the Apache for bringing trouble to their community. The town remained divided, though the balance had shifted toward tolerance and understanding. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Rancher reflected on how much his life had changed since that evening when he'd found a starving child on his land. He'd thought he was saving her, but in many ways, she had saved him. From loneliness, from the bitter isolation he'd wrapped around himself after losing his first family, and from the moral blindness that had infected his community. Ayanna approached him as he stood watching the sunset, her small hand slipping into his weathered one. She'd grown taller in the months since he'd found her, and her face had filled out with proper nutrition and care. But her eyes still held that ancient wisdom that had first struck him. "Are you happy, Grandfather Rancher?" she asked, using the Apache term of respect she'd adopted for him. Rancher smiled, feeling a peace he hadn't known in years. "Yes, little one, I'm happy." "Good," she said, with the serious expression that made her seem older than her years. "My real grandfather told me that happiness shared is happiness doubled. Now we are family, and our happiness grows stronger." Dakota joined them, carrying a bucket of milk from the cow they'd purchased with part of the government compensation. He'd grown into his role as the man of the family, taking on responsibilities that would have challenged someone twice his age. But he carried the burden with grace and dignity, never complaining about the loss of his childhood. "The federal investigators want me to testify at another trial next month," he told Rancher. "They've found evidence of similar schemes in other territories. It seems Morrison and Hayes weren't the only ones who thought genocide was an acceptable business practice." Rancher nodded grimly. "Will you go?" "Yes. If my testimony can prevent other families from suffering as ours did, then I have a duty to speak." Dakota's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much evil, but refused to let it break his spirit. As they stood together watching the stars appear in the darkening sky, Rancher knew that sometimes the greatest mysteries in life weren't puzzles to be solved, but gifts to be received. The mystery of why Ayanna had come into his life might never be fully understood, but the result was clear. Love had triumphed over hatred, understanding had conquered fear, and a lonely rancher had discovered that family could be found in the most unexpected places. The barn fire that had seemed like such a disaster had ultimately led to justice for the victims of a terrible crime and redemption for a community that had lost its way. The conspiracy that had sought to destroy Apache families had been exposed and punished, and new protections had been put in place to prevent such atrocities in the future. But perhaps most importantly, 3 people who had lost everything had found each other and created something new, a family built on love and respect rather than blood and tradition. They were living proof that healing was possible, that understanding could bridge even the deepest divisions, and that hope could flourish even in the darkest circumstances. As the night wind carried the scent of sage and desert flowers across the valley, Rancher felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him to this moment. The pain of losing his first family would never completely fade, but it had been joined by the joy of finding a new one. And in that balance between sorrow and happiness, between loss and discovery, he had found a peace that he'd never thought possible. The mystery that had begun with a starving child and a burning barn had revealed truths about human nature that were both terrible and beautiful. It had shown the depths of evil that people could sink to when motivated by greed and prejudice. But it had also demonstrated the heights of courage and compassion that could be reached when people chose to do what was right, rather than what was easy. And in the end, that was the most important lesson of all, that in a world full of darkness, even the smallest light could make a difference, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes were the ones who simply chose to care when caring seemed impossible. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.